Okay, so we're on the last section of the lecture where we're going through a few methods that are actual Agile programming techniques or Agile development techniques. Starting with extreme programming, there are a few things that distinguish extreme programming from other Agile methods. I think this list of 4 is a reasonably good starting point. It was one of the first approaches that focused very extensively on user stories as requirements replacements in the planning game. The idea behind a user story is that it is a little bit easier to reason about than individualized requirements. It also works better for the iterations being really, really tight in an Agile process. The second key piece here is that they're very big on pair programming, test-driven development, and continuous integration as a means of achieving quality in software development. We talked about pair programming in a previous lecture, so I'm not going to revamp that here, but that is a critical piece of extreme programming. The third is that the system is validated through customer acceptance tests, and that happens with regular meetings, actually with the customer there, with the stakeholder there, for these very small releases. That's pretty common amongst most Agile processes now, but at the time it was introduced with extreme programming, this was sort of a novel piece. Then the fourth criteria here is that you get flexibility by keeping things as simple as possible and making sure that each piece of code is following coding standards, has automated tests, and a clear owner who's responsible for ensuring that both of those things happen for each piece of code. Okay, so those are the 4 key characteristics of extreme programming. Here's kind of like a high-level model of how extreme programming works. The elements that are absolutely core to extreme programming are in the center. Those are the things you just have to do in order to consider yourself doing extreme programming. And as you move out from this center blue circle, right, test-driven development, refactoring, simple design, and pair programming, things become less essential. And so you may have a coding standard, a sustainable pace, and continuous integration, but you may not have clear collective ownership requirements, or you may not have a good metaphor for the process. And then the least essential pieces are the planning game, small releases, customer tests, and the whole team. Obviously, in a full extreme programming model, you would use all of these, but if you had to prioritize things that you wanted to include versus things that you did not want to include, you'd start cutting with this outer circle. So you may not have to do the planning game in order to have a plan. You could just begin with that first customer meeting. You may not have to have small releases or customer tests in order to build a product, meaning you could have somebody stand in for the customer, or maybe you would have 1-month cycles that would be a little bit larger than your typical small release. So the best book on extreme programming is Kent Beck's book. Kent Beck is a very well-known systems analyst, software developer, and researcher. And I think this is the second edition is sort of like the definitive guide to one of the most fundamentally Agile processes. If you're going to read anything on extreme programming, you really should read Kent Beck's book. So let's move on to Scrum, and we'll spend a little bit more time with this. Scrum seems to be the current hot method for doing this sort of Agile software development. And its main differentiating characteristic is this notion of really doubling down on incremental releases. That they've highly prioritized embracing an empirical approach to managing requirements change, and these small incremental releases are critical to that. There's several places where they use data and other software artifacts to help guide the process, and that's where they get to this empiricism. Some of the things that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in the following slides, they have a daily stand-up meeting, which is sort of a key feature of Scrum, where you're answering these 3 questions. What did you do yesterday? What are you doing today? And what's blocking you? The customer has to be involved in every part of the planning process in Scrum. That's a central piece of the process. And that you use mitigations for risks rather than ignoring them or setting them off to the side for future development, future iterations, that sort of thing. And most importantly, everything is transparent, so everybody knows the context of everything at all times. This is another reason why they do these daily stand-ups, so that there's transparency in the process at a day-to-day level as well. Here's a overview that you can reference. This is actually from the Wikipedia article on Scrum. And we'll come back to this in a moment. I just wanted to point out the key people involved in the process first, and then we'll talk about some of these things, and then I'll show you this again. We'll walk through it in a little bit more detail. First, we have a product owner over here. This is somebody who's explicitly representing the customer, the user, or the stakeholder. Often they are an actual customer, user, or stakeholder. That is the ideal scenario. Then we have a Scrum Master here in the middle who is operating exclusively like a team leader that's trying to make sure everyone on the development team can actually be as productive as possible. And this is the development team. You can see the development team and the product owner are involved here. This is just the development team, and then for the review and the retrospective, it's the development team along with the product owner. The Scrum Master is not involved in the reviews or the retrospective so that they can remain a sort of agnostic, process-oriented person, making sure that the process is working as smoothly as possible. This gives you somebody who is not focused on the product in these meetings, but just the process as it stands. Okay, so sprints. This is a key piece of the Scrum process. This is what they use, the term they use for iterations. And they consist essentially of a 2-week period where you're basically planning a small scope of work that everybody agrees on in advance. And then you have at the end of the sprint a review where you're basically looking at what's happening with the product, and a retrospective where you're looking at what's working with the process and what concerns do you have with the process. So that is the idea behind a sprint, and that's essentially what's happening here, right, just inside this cycle. The daily Scrum meeting is something that you would do in a very structured fashion. Essentially, it's a stand-up meeting. Everyone's in the same place at the same time every single day for a stand-up meeting that lasts at most 15 minutes, and your goal there is to just answer those 3 questions again. You know, what'd you do yesterday? What are you planning to do today? And do you have something blocking you? Is there some problem coming up that makes it less easy for you to do your job? So this is essentially just a meeting to prevent pointless meetings and enable useful ones. If you did not have this meeting, then you might have to schedule long, hour-long meetings where everybody's like, yep, everything works the way that we thought it would. Or you'd have no incentive to meet across functional teams to solve those big blocking issues, right? So if somebody has a roadblock that somebody else on the team is like, oh, I know an immediate answer to that, right? That's the kind of thing that sometimes would get lost in the process if it required a 1-hour meeting with the entire team to address. So the daily Scrum meeting, a 15-minute meeting where you're just answering these questions, can actually make meetings more useful and eliminate all of the really pointless, annoying meetings. And you can see that on the chart right here. This is the daily Scrum that happens throughout this entire sprint process. The product backlog. Okay, user stories, requirements, features, use cases are just a list of things that you are interested in building into the product. That is your product backlog. Okay, whatever list you have of all those pieces that you want to build into the system, that's the product backlog. Everybody can see this list, including stakeholders, including the product owner, the customer, you know, the user. They are able to see this sort of thing. Every item in the list has some estimated effort, and typically this is done using story points. I'm not going to go into detail on story points because there are lots of different ways of doing this, but I will say that it is a quintessential piece of Scrum. You cannot really do Scrum without having a story point. And this is something that's defined by the development team, and it's really only meant to represent effort. So not time, but effort. If you wanted to think of it as a something that you might be able to bootstrap, maybe you could. Kind of depends on the thing. So for example, if we're talking about eating a piece of pizza, having one person eat the piece of pizza is going to take a certain amount of effort. That amount of effort does not change if we cut the piece of pizza into like 4 pieces and have 4 different people eating the pizza at the same time, right? Because now instead of just one person being engaged, we have 4 people being engaged for a quarter of the effort. That's the idea behind story points. We're trying to measure that amount of that quality of the piece of software that you're building. The product owner, though, is doing all the prioritization on what's needed and what's not needed. So they can see the effort, they can see the story points that are assigned to each of these elements in the product backlog, and they can use that, they can rationalize that as a part of their prioritization. But the key piece here is developers define effort, and the product owner is defining the prioritization. So you never have this conflict between the two where developers are saying, well, we don't have time for that, or that would require too much effort, and the customer is saying, well, I absolutely have to have it, so do it in this very short period of time. By separating the two, you can get more accurate estimates of each. And the product backlog is represented here. This is the product backlog, and the product owner is actually creating this prioritization. All right, finally, the burn down charts. Burn down charts are just a visualization of the number of tasks that are left to make sure that you're on target to meet some deployment date. This is a technique that has been used in a wide variety of cases, but it is a critical part of the Scrum process. These are examples from Wikipedia. This one actually will link directly to Wikipedia when you grab it in the slides. And there's lots of different ways you can do it. You can see in this first one, we have the sum of the number of tasks remaining, right? And then the iteration of how many days until our end point. In this particular case, we're measuring the y-axis as effort, right? The number of hours. You could do story points left as well, like the total number of story points. And again, we have days here, but you can see the task number is actually represented in the chart. So you'd be able to see the total number of tasks that are remaining, or at least the effort for each of these tasks that's remaining. And you'd have an ideal burn down rate, the number of completed tasks would appear, or at least the effort for each of the completed tasks would appear on the days somewhere in the chart itself. So lots of different ways you can do a burn down chart, but it is something that I would recommend doing in some sort of a Scrum process. And then finally, a book recommendation. You may have heard of the Agile Software Development with Scrum. That was, for a long time, the quintessential book on Scrum, but I think it's a little bit dated now. I don't know if they're working on a second edition. I think this book is actually a pretty good replacement for that book. It's much more recent, and it goes into a few of the Scrum variants that have become extremely popular, some of which work really well, many of which do not. This book highlights the ones that I think are worth implementing. And it can help you identify process failures a little bit better than Agile Software Development with Scrum. So Ken Rubin's book on Essential Scrum, probably the one you want to pick up if you are interested in learning more about Scrum.